Facts are facts, or are they? I'm Terry Young, and this is another episode of Reasonable Discourse, along with my colleague, Sean McAvoy. And today we're going to talk about, Sean, how facts aren't always facts, at least when it comes to the recent use in politics and other social matters concerning history. So why is it that history isn't just black and white?
Well, first off, it has to do with the nature of history. It's always selective. It's always told for a particular reason. Legitimation is an excellent one. Most recent example we just had with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, the son of a prominent Israeli historian on the Holocaust, who made a comment to a local audience, essentially, that a Palestinian leader, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, essentially talked Adolf Hitler into the eliminationist anti-Semitism of the Holocaust, talked him into changing from expelling Jews from Europe to exterminating them in the camps. That doesn't really track historically, and he knows that, but it played very well to his audience.
Well, and he, in fact, even some of his closest political allies were a little shocked by his comments because there was almost no evidence whatsoever. I mean, certainly the Mufti met with Hitler, yet the efforts the Nazis had undertaken to kill Jews in Germany had already begun before that meeting. No one, although people may think that they shared the same ideas about exterminating Jews, no one believed that Hitler was convinced by this man.
True. Also a possibility that his comments, just thinking about it, could have been sparked by his meeting with Angela Merkel in Germany, as she comes from East Germany, which traditionally has denied any responsibility for the Holocaust. So he might have had another foreign policy reason, but it still comes out to the same thing. History is malleable. History can be twisted to fit whatever you want it to.
And I thought it was interesting that Merkel's response was immediately to say, no, this was our fault.
This was German.
This was all Germany, which was not something you would think that a leader would be quick to jump on, but that's what she did. But this is not the first instance where we've had politicians or other individuals in society referring back to history. Now, I think we all understand that there are aspects of history that are subject to interpretation, especially when you get into discussions about the why something happened, as opposed to the what. But now it seems like the what is often being called into question. Why is that happening?
Well, the what, again, is another construct. We have, well, in history, historians talk about meta-narratives, that there is this standard story that is told by any culture, religion, nation. It is the accepted version of history. The facts are almost always going to be selective. There are counter-narratives. Now, it can be useful to create a counter-narrative, such as in America, bringing in the counter-narrative of black history or Indian history, women's history, as opposed to the standard white men ran the country, yada, yada, yada. However, that again points to the fact history is not one set thing.
Right.
Depends who's telling it, how they're telling it, and you have to be selective. History, after all, as you know, is filled with a lot of meaningless moments.
Certainly.
A good example was just reading a Dalek's biography of Kissinger and Nixon. A lot was left out of it, but arguably a lot should be. For instance, we know people go to the bathroom all the time. We don't need to read about everything for 5 years going on between their digestive systems.
Absolutely.
We do need to weed things out. We also need to tell a story. Who's telling the story and why is sometimes more important than what is going on in history.
And how that story is framed. And another question I have for you would be, these days, what tends to be the sources that people use to acquire their understanding of history?
Same sources they use for everything else. Books are out of favor, the internet, social media, Twitter. If it can be quickly looked up, especially Wikipedia. If I can go to Wikipedia and get my answer in 30 seconds, it's history or it's a fact. And I'm sure you've seen quite a few of this in your teaching career.
Absolutely. But I'm starting to think with some of the commentary, though, that we see, I was going to perhaps mention a potential target being in social media, that it almost makes Wikipedia look like the Encyclopedia Britannica in comparison with some of the information. There's an old adage that history is written by the victors. But yet, it seems like we found out this summer that that's not always the case. Let's just back up and take a look at an example of how history can be viewed differently when we think about the controversy over the Confederate battle flag at the State House in South Carolina. Now, some may question whether the focus should have even been on what happened in the Civil War as it related to the propriety of having the battle flag over the State House in Columbia anyway. But the fact is, a lot of people harken back to the days of the Civil War, and I saw some very interesting perceptions of history come out of that this summer. Why was that the case? I mean, we saw people arguing that some of the important issues regarding the Civil War really weren't involved at all, like slavery. How did that come about?
As far as?
Well, I guess what is the alternative to the notion that this war, South Carolina begins their succession over the issue of slavery, and that was the central focus of the war. I guess what I'm getting at, how do we have this development of the lost cause?
The lost cause.
From the South.
Very basically, that concept, the winners write the histories, losers write them too. There are a lot of examples of history of the losers having the dominant narrative. In the South, it was a need to justify the South against losing a war. There was, in the Civil War, a lot of religion. It was a more religious time. Many Southerners really did interpret the Civil War in religious terms, that there was a requirement by God to secede from the godless North, that the Lord wanted us to engage in this holy quest. For some people, slavery was primary. For some, to be fair, it wasn't. Either way, 1865 comes around, God let us down. We've now lost. Something's happened. There is a need now to explain how what was supposed to be a crusade wound up being a disaster. And the lost cause, to a great extent, comes out of this need to rationalize. And you get ideas such as in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the South had to suffer the way Jesus did on the cross. The South lost the war just like Jesus was whipped and had the crown of thorns put on him. And the lost cause is a very interesting whole development on that front.
So, and it's to me, it's interesting because I think to a great extent it was probably wholly unnecessary. I mean, some historians have argued, Gary Gallagher, for example, that it even begins when Robert E. Lee is writing his memoirs. He focuses on the difference in resources that the Union had compared to the Confederacy, and yet no one would question Robert E. Lee's military ability and the fact that he was able to take, using far fewer resources, able to achieve tremendous success during the Civil War, yet there was still this need to defend that.
Mm-hmm. And actually that plays back into the debate too, because the one person who did question Lee, James Longstreet, the man who probably knew him best in the military, who did see Lee's flaws, and Lee did have them, had his historical reputation completely wrecked. Okay. By the end of his life, he is a nobody in the South, and his reputation still hasn't completely recovered.
In fact, the one clear disaster in Robert E. Lee's time as General of the Army of Northern Virginia was Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and so there were some who started to suggest that that wasn't really Robert E. Lee's fault, that was instead
Longstreet's fault for not enthusiastically endorsing what honestly was an idiotic idea. Yeah. But that's how history gets done.
Well, and we could probably look at, there were a couple reasons why Longstreet became a scapegoat that some historians have suggested. The one may be a little more controversial, but one, he was not a Virginian, as many of the leading commanders in the Civil War were. And then, of course, secondly, his political affiliation after the Civil War. He was a Republican in Reconstruction South, which...
And a close personal friend of Ulysses S. Grant.
Right.
Then there's the third issue, his religion. Yeah. He converted to Roman Catholicism.
That's correct, absolutely.
In a very Protestant South.
So we have all these things that can affect how history is viewed. But we've seen in the realm of modern politics, and we talked about Netanyahu's speech, but even in political campaigns, I mean, we're very accustomed to politicians using hyperbole. Whether it's the Lyndon Johnson campaign suggesting a vote for Barry Goldwater was a vote for nuclear war.
Or a vote for Thomas Jefferson in 1800 was a vote against God and for the execution of Christians.
Those things are not uncommon, but I think most people would say at the end of the day, it almost reminds me of the one of the old cartoons you used to see on Looney Tunes where there was a sheepdog and a wolf, and they would go at each other all day long, and then at the end of the day they would hit the time clock, punch the time clock, and tell each other have a good evening and take off. That in their heart of hearts that these politicians really didn't believe some of the ideas that they were espousing against their opponents. But now we're starting to hear statements made in the political realm that you wonder whether or not there's some real genuine belief. I'll give you an example. One politician, or actually not a politician, but candidate for the presidency, Ben Carson, has done quite well as an outsider. But on several occasions, he has made references to events that happened in Germany under Hitler, and has even gone forward to make a statement that living in America today is like living in Germany under Hitler. Now, is it have we forgotten things, or have we just not paid attention to historical realities that people can say things like this, or is there some other explanation for it? Or do you believe it is just hyperbole? Is it just the same old political trick, and some people are so good at it that we don't recognize it as that?
Partially that. Partially, again, I would say it's the audience. Ben Carson in particular seems to be polling well with evangelical Christians, people who are mostly white, mostly middle class, could be some lower class in there, but mostly people who hate Obama. And when he makes a statement like we're living in Nazi Germany, it is a way for him to quietly say Obama is Hitler. That plays very well with his audience. Does he know that that's not accurate? I really don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if he did.
Yeah.
But to win political points, to win an election, politicians usually will do just about anything.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to tell how serious someone is taking the issue. I mean, we talk about hyperbole. Hillary Clinton, who served as Secretary of State at a time when we were dealing with significant enemies abroad, has made the comment that her biggest enemies are the Republicans. So we don't know. Or you hope that there's some recognition that they don't really mean that internally, but it's hard to tell sometimes, isn't it?
It is. On the other hand, we're a very political culture. It would not be a big surprise if many people did believe that. Many average people today define themselves, I'm a Republican, this is a Republican house, this is a Democratic house. I know people who will not even speak to people of a different political party. It's really kind of part of our DNA.
And it seems to be sort of, and we've had this discussion before about divisiveness in politics, it seems to be getting worse, I think, instead of better.
Which brings me back actually to the Confederate flag, speaking of divisiveness, and the uses of history, because there is a real interesting use of history in the whole Confederate flag debate. People who are against the Confederate flag flying, many of whom, but not all, are black Americans, but we do have some white Americans and others, say it's a symbol of slavery, period, end of sentence. Okay. You get to the other side and they'll talk about its heritage, Southern heritage, period, end of sentence. On neither side do you get discussions of, well, the Confederate flag hasn't been flying in the South Carolina State House since 1865.
Right.
It was dredged out in the 1950s during the civil rights debates.
Yeah, and I guess flown, on the centennial of the beginning of the Civil War in '61. Sure, and I guess even, and we touched on this a little bit, even looking at the differences from secession and the causes of war, there were a lot of complex ideas going on with that issue. But you're right. I mean, it was placed above the State House at a time when you had a segregationist legislature fighting to maintain African Americans in South Carolina really as second-class citizens. There were, where I think they linked it back to the Civil War may have been the idea that they were fighting against infringement by the federal government in 1961 to desegregate South Carolina society as opposed to trample upon their belief in states' rights and the failure of the federal government to adequately enforce the fugitive slave law.
Right.
So yeah, that was an issue where history played an important role, whether it really should have or not. I mean, I think you can make a lot of arguments as to why, especially in the context of how that battle flag was placed in 1961, that it should have been removed long ago. But then some would ask, did it really have anything to do with the terrible tragedy that occurred in Charleston this year?
Or also the debate right now in Mississippi. The Mississippi flag does have the Confederate battle flag within its canton. Difference is the Mississippi flag has been flying since the 1890s, long before any of these issues really came up. So it's not even as simple as saying history in a symbol or how a symbol's interpreted through history. The same symbol can be interpreted in various ways. As to South Carolina, hard to say how much that piece of cloth was important in the shooter's mind. At the end of the day, though, the shooter still made a decision to ruthlessly murder a number of people.
Sure. And so I think that just the fact that attention was drawn to that, although we've had this issue here, even in Virginia, going back to the 1994 U.S. Senate campaign. One thing, though, that seems to be missing with a lot of the discussions we had this past summer, the context of, why do you have a Confederate battle flag, or what's the purpose for it? I think most people would say if you go to one of the many Civil War battlefields that we have around the country and you see a Confederate battle flag flying, I don't think people take offense at that idea. I mean, it's the context of why it's there.
Right.
And that's why I guess it was disappointing that folks didn't really think about when this flag was placed above the State House. What was the South Carolina legislature's reasoning behind that?
And also, it's the exact symbol chosen. It's the Confederate battle flag. Now, that is one common defense of it is, well, it's Southern heritage. Well, if that's Southern heritage, the Confederacy did have three national flags. The Stars and Bars, the Stainless Banner, and the third national flag. I would think any of those three would be more adequate symbols of Southern heritage, if that's really your thing, than the battle flag.
Right.
You rarely see those, however, flying. So you have to question why this particular symbol is the one that's being fought over and endorsed.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing that you and I have had some discussions about concerning history is the fact that seems to be this effort to maybe politicize things within the realm of history curriculum. We've seen this. I think Texas has had a number of controversies concerning how they treat certain historical topics. There have been people who have been angry at how the advanced placement U.S. history classes have viewed certain topics. What's your take on all that, the I guess, politicizing history?
It's inevitable, humans being political animals. When it comes to textbooks in particular, one thing history teaches us is if you can control the textbooks, you control the next generation. We used that to particular effect at the end of the Second World War when we had to re-educate the Nazis to eliminate their anti-Semitism. We actually pulled textbooks from the pre-Nazi period, reprinted them, and put them in German schools to make sure we were wiping out the ideas of Nazism. It is a way of guaranteeing the future. The history, you just write it however you want to see it. Texas, they do want a particular version of history, one that de-emphasizes slavery and the negative effects of it. And as I understand it, they also took most mentions of Thomas Jefferson out of some of their textbooks.
Yeah, well, as a graduate of the University of Virginia, you might know how I feel about that. So where do we go from here? We have a lot of people who are students today who view things like the History Channel and what do they see on the History Channel now? They see episodes of shows about pawn shows and Bigfoot and
Ancient aliens.
yes, and they, which are all quite fascinating. And then, or they may look on social media, and history is delivered to them through memes about whether it's a picture of the Confederate flag saying, if you believe this stands for hate, you don't know history, or if you believe this stands for heritage, you don't know history, whatever your position might be on it. Little snippets of opinion about historical events. But what's the future hold for the way we view American history?
I think the future, in a way, is like the past in this respect. It will be what people want it to be. I really don't see that in the past there was so much. We like to think of it as people learned their history from books, they had got it right. The history that was learned 50 years ago was a very peculiar version that today would not be tolerated. Going forward, we're going to see other versions that we're not going to like. Unfortunately, history is something that's going to be reinterpreted for each new generation the way it wants history to read, to whatever usually is convenient for that generation, what makes it most comfortable. It's just a fact of the way humans, I think, operate. Speaking of these memes and social media, I'm curious, what effect have you seen on these, on your teaching? Do these seem to impact the quality of the knowledge your students walk in with, or their opinions on history?
Well, I think for any of us who are standing up in front of that classroom, you hope that we do our best, I guess, to try to get students to look at things in a whole new way and not be too impacted not only by what they have heard before, but not impacted by what they hear in our classrooms either, but instead show a willingness to think for themselves about these issues, to evaluate all sources of information critically, and hopefully really do their best to learn the real story to the extent they can, and then they can formulate their own opinions about the things that are not black and white, the things that really do require you pursuing one level of interpretation or another. But I think that's our best hope. I think about some of the controversies, and I think it was written well by conservative columnist David Brooks this summer in the New York Times. He said, American history is full of glory and it's full of shame, and I think we do a disservice when we try to hide either aspect of that. Well, we appreciate you folks being with us as we present another episode of Reasonable Discourse. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Good evening.